Hello, ARC family. Welcome to the ARC journey. We're continuing with God's story of the ARC, and Dr. Guy is sharing with us from his knowledge our history. So, Dr. Guy, if you would take it over.
Well, this has been a pleasure to dig into our past, how we got where we are, how we became who we are, and today we're actually going to dive into some of the nuts and bolts of the Allegheny region. It's still just going to be an entry point, but it was drilled into my head when I was a young student that context is key. And you can know a lot of details, you can know your church and a whole bunch of stories, but until you put them into some sort of context, there's nothing to read, and it's easy to get the wrong picture. So, what we're going to do today is kind of put the West Pennsylvania eldership on the genealogical map between Weinbrenner getting started in the 1820s, and what becomes the denominational headquarters, which had moved from Harrisburg out to Findlay, Ohio. And I've never read anywhere where anybody really connects those dots well. It's just kind of this random kind of first this happened, then that happened. But um, Weinbrenner's Church of God did not come out of a vacuum. And hopefully, in future episodes, we'll be able to take a deeper dive into who Weinbrenner was, what made him the way he was, what made his outlook on the Church of God the way it became, what sort of people were attracted to him and drawn into this Church of God unfolding movement. And uh, there's a lot of stories just to answer those questions. But for those of us that have lived in Western Pennsylvania, it's easy to assume that our world has always been the way it is. And it's helpful to realize that it hasn't. Where I am sitting right now was Seneca country. It was not part of the United States. It was not part of Pennsylvania until about the time John Weinbrenner was born. So until we start realizing some of those things and tracing the movements of the population, we'll have an inadequate picture of how we became the Church of God, especially when we realize that three of our first churches in Western Pennsylvania, when they started, were in areas that 50 years before were not in the United States. Um, one of the things that One of the other things that's really important for us to realize is that from the start, John Weinbrenner uh, put front and center. It was front and center in his own convictions, but he put front and center in the Church of God that we're a missional people, a missionary people, because God is a missionary God. It's all about Jesus and his gospel. And you can nitpick and slice and dice and have opinions and all that kind of thing, but none of it matters in comparison, in reference to Christ and his gospel. And part of the story of the Church of God is that he emerged in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the place where disenfranchised, disillusioned, displaced, persecuted peoples migrated to because there was freedom of conscience from the beginning. It had 100-year legacy of that, more than that actually, by the time the nation began. So there were all of these German peoples that were displaced. They came from all over the continental Europe, wherever they had migrated to get away from the persecutors. But here they enjoyed freedom. And here they began realizing, as different as we may be, we have a lot in common. And as a matter of fact, as they got to talking, they realized they had a lot in common in reference to their convictions and their faith. They might be Reforms, they might be Lutherans, they might be Moravians, they might be Mennonites, but they spoke German and they believed in Jesus. And Weinbrenner picked up on that and started proclaiming the gospel in these open air meetings. And it didn't matter what your background was. Those that prioritized the gospel started finding in Weinbrenner something refreshing, not a divisiveness, but something that began to unite them. You read those early testimonies of those believers, it's all about the gospel and their response to it, and coming together as the church of God. And um, that was happening as the nation was opening and moving west. So, in a nutshell, after the War of 1812, the fears of the West went away. And so in the 18 teens, people started migrating in huge doses, basically because the land had been filling up. People were waiting until things were stabilized. And once they were, they went. And one of the interesting things about the Allegheny region is we got passed over very quickly. And the reason is because those lands that were available were already occupied, or they were reserved for the veterans. And so there weren't open lands yet. Um, what's also interesting is when you wonder, you would expect, just if you're piecing it together from speculation, you would think that we would have migrated right into eastern Ohio. Why didn't we do that? Why are all the Church of God churches way out there, not near Youngstown, not near Akron, Canton? We had a couple there at some point, but the thrust was, and here's why: those eastern Ohio lands were reserved as well, mainly for Massachusetts, Connecticut, all the New England states that had no more land. They were the fire lands. They were the reserve, the Western Reserve lands, and so it was only as the lands further west on the other side of Akron, out near Findlay, of course, when those opened up. Sandusky, of course, is where the Hickernell, Thomas Hickernell settled, and but that's where the people were going. And you might wonder why the Ohio Conference came about earlier than the West Pennsylvania Conference. That's why, because all the action was moving to Western Ohio at the time. Now, it does make sense when you realize the missionaries in the Church of God all came from those early meetings out in Eastern Pennsylvania. So to get to Western Ohio, they had to pass back and forth, and they built relationships. They started connecting with people. They didn't really hold any meetings, but they did connect with people. And that's the other thing about the Church of God in those early days. It was personal, it was relational. They um, they earned trust. They found kind of people that had some of the same convictions as they did, and they bonded with those people, stayed repeatedly with them, both back and forth, particularly the ones down around Alverton, because that was the road to Pittsburgh went down through there. And the Rosenberger is the one name that he was one of the big contacts with the early Church of God missionaries, and it's no wonder that John Hickernell ended up building his own house down there in that Bethany community, where those first relationships were built. More about him in the future, um, but it's not till 1844 that the Allegheny region is actually born. The first I think the first meeting was somewhere around 1838 or 39. It might have been as early as 1837. The Hickernells were involved in that. But the first meeting um, was in Venango County in Western Pennsylvania. I would have thought it would have been down around Alverton, but they had those contacts. I don't really know how they made those contacts, except that because these lands had been reserved, one of the lines of research that I've been doing is tapping into who those people were that became aware of those lands and helped to facilitate the purchase of those lands that had been reserved that were being opened up again. And one of the interesting things about that is that uh, one of the members of the Andersontown Church in East Penn um, was related to, came from an Anglican family, was related to a family that had a bunch of early missionaries and lawyers. And his relatives uh, basically had settled in, one was a circuit rider, one of the Methodists' first circuit riders. Um, his name was Robert Ayres, and he settled down south of Pittsburgh, but he traveled north to Franklin and then back down to Brownsville, north to Franklin, back down to Brownsville. And this fellow by the name of John Ayres was his nephew, was an attorney. Another one of those relatives was an attorney out of Butler, Pennsylvania. And those pieces show how why some of those communities were pretty instrumental in the first years of the Allegheny region. And John Ayres married into another Church of God family, and they were actually the first couple that moved to Iowa. So they, when things opened up out west, they went west very quickly. But the Barkeyville Church of God uh, building is actually built on the land that was once owned by John Ayres, and then was left to his wife, who was the Ross. And it was the Rosses that deeded it to Barkey and those folks in the 1860s. But it's difficult to piece those things together. But it's the two takeaways that just kind of help us as we're getting our bearings here is that it was relational. They had friends who had friends, they had family who had friends, and they followed those relational chains. Church planning, when it's done well, has not changed at all. It's all about relationships in which you're sharing your convictions, you're building something together. There's a measure of trust, and it's when we come together as God's family that the meaningful things can be celebrated. And that's really what birthed the Allegheny region, was those personal relationships that were built in those early years. And I'll have more to say about that in the next episode. But the primary thing was what they shared in common most of all. Everybody has different opinions. You can fight about all sorts of things, but Jesus is the foundation.
Mm.
He was the mission of God. God sent his son. His son, that first Christmas, took on human flesh, took on the human dilemma, and addressed that human dilemma as a human for us and for our salvation. That's a message. It doesn't matter what flavor of Christian you are, that's who we are. And that's what makes us Christian, that simple belief that God in Christ saves us sinners. And that's probably enough for today.
Fantastic. So, as we are entering into the new year, and you're looking at your goals for the future, coming back to our roots, understanding where we've come from, and what are those foundations that have set us moving forward, uh, utilizing them to develop where you're going in the next year, I think is going to be critical. Focusing on the gospel, focusing on building relationships, focusing on making disciples, just where we are and how we're planted, and that's what builds churches. It builds churches in the community. And so I'm interested as you go and you talk about John Hickert now. So from my from my research and from my understanding, so I don't know if you're going to address this next time or you can use this next time to tell me I'm off base, but it appeared to me that John Hickernell, the Hickernell boys, right, the brothers, when they came to the Allegheny region, were focused first and foremost on sharing the gospel and doing camp meetings, and those and this is who we are. I think this is who we are. This is what we're coming back to. If you want to talk about church planning strategy, this is it. They were most interested in leading people to Jesus and then building relationships with those who came to Christ. They were much less concerned, in my opinion, with starting churches than they were with feeding and discipling those who came to Jesus. And those communities, all of these churches that were birthed, all came naturally out of those relationships. But their first and foremost focus was on leading people to Jesus.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And once they found Christ, it's about feeding them and nurturing them and growing them in the faith.
And those people came together organically because we're family, we are neighbors, and so we just come together, and the Hickernells joined them when they were passing through. I mean, it was like, okay, we want to plan to visit you, but that's how a church started.
Yep,
It's not hard. It's not rocket science.
it
This
is
is
not.
it.
It is
All
not.
right. Thanks, brother. Keep shining. We'll talk to you next week. Bye bye.